Begin, we'll just record. Okay,
All right.
great. Well, so super excited today to have Thomas Costello joining us. Thomas Costello, for those of you who don't know, is the assistant professor of social and decision science at Carnegie Mellon University. Has a history with MIT and has been here a few times and worked with David Rand over at MIT Sloan. Um, And something that really made his work stand out to us was a few years ago, I believe it's a little over a year ago, and a few months, Thomas put out a paper on reducing conspiracy beliefs using just dialogues with AI systems. And I think since then, Thomas, you've been working on a lot of sort of related papers on how these AI systems may help us better understand the true and false information around us. Um, so we're super excited to learn more about that. And I know you're very active. I see constantly you're putting out new papers on this topic. So super excited to hear what's happening in that space.
Yeah.
Um, all right. So Thomas Costello, yeah, is an assistant professor of social and decision sciences at CMU, Carnegie Mellon University, but is also affiliated with the Human Computer Interaction Institute at MIT Sloan School of Management. He studies where political and social beliefs come from, how they differ from person to person, and ultimately why they change, using artificial intelligence and tools of personality, cognitive, clinical, and political science. He has over 40 research papers in peer reviewed outlets, including Science, Nature, Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, Psychological Bulletin, Trends in Cognitive Science, and more. And of course, his work has been recognized and featured in a lot of places that we all know about: New York Times, The Atlantic, so forth. Super big voice in this space. But yeah, glad to have you, and thank you so much for joining. And please take it away.
Yeah. It's so wonderful to be here. I really admire the likewise the work that the AHA is doing and the stuff
Sorry,
on
Thomas, I don't think that we can hear you. Vault, can you hear?
Oh yeah, yeah, I hear you. I hear you fine, Thomas.
oh, okay.
Oh,
Can
it's just me then.
okay, great.
Sorry about that.
Cool. Well, yeah, it's delightful to be here. I think I think the work that this group is doing is phenomenal. I am just quickly, let's see, I'll share my screen. Um, can folks, it's funny to be asking this so far into the Zoom era, but can everyone see? Okay.
Yes, we see you.
Okay, great. And here, let me just get oriented so I can see uh, yeah, the chat too. Uh, okay, I'm hoping to make this fairly interactive and back and forth. I do have some work to share, and some new studies, some new data, also in progress things that we're doing that are kind of like field studies and involving like taking this show out of the lab and onto the digital road. Um, but more generally, in the spirit of dialogue, which is through and through a lot of this work, I think I'd be curious to hear everyone's thoughts, and so feel free to chime in at any time. I'm gonna try to be quick and also go quickly through some of the empirical things. Although if you want to drill down, we can. Because I do want to end with some big questions and have a bit more of a discussion, as I think that the question of whether we can induce these positive outcomes in the lab is meaningfully different from whether we can do it at an ecosystem level. And in some ways, the much harder challenge is translational and implementational. And so I don't have a solution there. I do have some ideas, but I think maybe it's like a good place for collective intelligence. Okay. So all of that said, please stop me and jump in. I guess if you're in the webinar mode, you can't actually vocally jump in, but maybe do it through the chat and I'll keep my eye on it. Okay. So yeah, big picture, OpenAI put out this interesting paper titled something along the lines of like, how do people use ChatGPT? And within that paper is this figure, which I find quite fascinating. Uh, and if you pool practical guidance and seeking information, which are the two biggest clusters other than writing, you can kind of squint and see that about half of all ChatGPT usage is people interacting informationally in some capacity, whether that is like learning something new, getting advice, or more importantly, like for my context, getting specific information, which is this big red block. And so, LLMs, as we're moving from chatbots to agents, their usage is going to change. And one thing I do want to talk about at the end is like how agents kind of shift some of these dynamics in important ways. But right now, people are using it as like Google Search plus, and also kind of as an alternative to social media. And this introduces some kind of interesting and I think positive dynamics into the information ecosystem. People gain their political, social beliefs not through like reasoning from axioms, from first principles about like what is right and wrong, what the world is like, and what we ought to strive for, how we ought to kind of create the world. But it's like we're outsourcing in many respects, relying on trusted intermediaries to tell us about the world. And this has some kind of odd features, right? It means that we're susceptible to something called the bullshit asymmetry principle or Brandolini's law, which is the idea that it's much harder to introduce a bad idea than it is to refute it. So we have this little comic and someone saying, I think the moon is made of cheese. And someone puts in all this effort to refute it and talks about spectrographic analysis and other sorts of things. And it's much harder than saying the moon is made of cheese. And even like according to this comic, the person still doesn't update even after all the effort, although I'm skeptical of the comic's conclusion. And so, right, in this paper on conspiracies that I'm going to just go through very quickly, we had this idea like, well, actually, AI sort of reduces all that cognitive labor that you'd otherwise have to do to refute conspiracy beliefs. It evens the playing field a little bit, and this is a really nice feature of LLMs as that can kind of serve as a store of humanity's knowledge and expert knowledge and explain it to accessibly. And this is a perspective that it's similar to what the political scientist Henry Farrell has argued in some places, as well as the philosopher Dan Williams, who's writing on this I really like. Uh, so if we can get AI to help people reason more clearly, that seems like a good thing, especially compared to the counterfactual of social media. Uh, but there are different perspectives about how much this kind of like information provision will matter when it comes to social and culturally contested things, where you can learn via perception not to touch a hot stove or a thing that's glowing red because you do it and you get burned and you get immediate, fast and accurate feedback and you learn. But for social and cultural things that are more diffuse, that are obscure, that have conflicting evidence, and that are on like very long time scales, or the difference between a policy being implemented and any noticed changes in the environment is quite wide. And so under that ambiguous information, like according to a Bayesian account, it's prior dominant, or priors are going to sort of shape how we interpret this ambiguous evidence. And so maybe facts won't be that important. And you can even go a step further and say like that there's this thing called motivated reasoning that people's motives shape the way that they interpret evidence, not just their priors. And according to social psychologists, motivated reasoning plays a really big part in how we evaluate politically and culturally salient information. That people are susceptible to all of these biases, and perhaps no place is like this more apparent than, for instance, conspiracy beliefs, where um, um, if you're really far down the rabbit hole, it's hard to get out. And so there's motivated reasoning. And in our initial foray into this space, we thought we could kind of compare these different perspectives. And like maybe the idea is that uh, it's not so much that people are motivated, um, but uh, they just haven't had the experience of seeing rich, in-depth, expert-delivered information on the topic that they're misinformed about. And people are roughly Bayesian, they have these priors, but if you can do the equivalent of burning their hand on a hot stove by overwhelming them with information, you're going to get a belief update. And so the reason, and this is true, that there have been all these past attempts to change strongly held beliefs, and they haven't been so successful, they've only gotten smaller null updates, is because they've kind of been engaging with the like they've taken as likely to be true this motivated perspective that you shouldn't use evidence. And similarly, in like the health communication literature, that there's this idea of an information gap based perspective, and simply just filling an information gap is like far too simplistic, that you need to like build trust and do all of these other things. So different literatures and fields converge on the idea that we should be skeptical of just providing facts and evidence as a solution. And I think there's certainly some truth to that. But I also think that human beings have historically been quite bad at producing compelling facts and evidence designed to change the minds of people who they disagree with and who have maybe different priors and different sets of perspectives than they do. So the idea initially was like, well, what could do this really well? What could actually like make a quite compelling case? What has access to all of this information? What can personalize arguments to address like the priors of a given person? And of course, like yeah, the answer is frontier large models, large language models, which are trained on this enormous corpus of text, seem to have a sense of what is true and what is not, and are quite good at communicating with human beings. And what we did initially was test whether we could change conspiracy theorists' minds by putting them in dialogue with an LLM. I just to quickly walk you through this paradigm, because this is going to show up a few times throughout like the later work that I'll talk about. So the idea is someone comes in and they just describe a belief that they have. In this case, it was a conspiracy. It doesn't have to be, but they do it in their own words. So here's a participant who talked about the 9/11 attacks, and they gave all this evidence. They said jet fuel doesn't burn hot enough to melt steel beams and stuff like that. We then have AI create a closed-ended question based on their open-ended statement in real time. So they then get a follow-up question that's like, here's what you said. The 9/11 attacks were orchestrated by the government. And on a scale of 0 to 100, how much do you believe this? And in this case, the person said 100%. I believe it. And you can also do some filtering on the back end where, like, if people are not doing a good job or confused, you can correct them or kick them out of the experiment. AI facilitated behavioral science opens up all these interesting methodological possibilities. And in this case, they just had a 3 round back and forth dialogue with the AI, but you can facilitate these interactions in different ways. And our prompt was very simple. It was just like be super persuasive and effective. And here's what the person said, and you have to change their mind and change their beliefs and make them less conspiratorial. And in the control, we had a few inert conversations where the person talked about whether they like cats or dogs and things like that. And so they had this conversation. That they last about 10 minutes, and then afterward we can ask them more questions. So we can say like, here's the belief that you endorsed at the beginning. Now how much do you believe it? And then this participant went all the way down to 40. And indeed, like when you look across everyone, thousands of people, you get this really nice effect, this clear reduction, about 20% in their conspiracy belief, which was like at that point unprecedented, and it's about one standard deviation. But I think even more remarkable than this is that it lasted, it endured when we followed up with participants even 2 months later. So they remembered the conversation, and they no longer believe the conspiracy. So it was a true belief change, which is kind of hard to get. You might be curious about what kinds of conspiracy beliefs people talked about. These were the most common ones that we identified, using a topic model, and found that the effects were homogeneous across the different conspiracy topics. So it seemed to work for everything, including like quite controversial ones like election fraud and things related to COVID-19. there's a lot of details in the paper that I will not get into right now for the sake of time, but one that I think is worth highlighting is that it even worked for people who were really strongly um, certain that their conspiracy was true. And it also spilled over to other conspiracy beliefs that were not discussed during the conversation and that the participant did not bring up. The effect here was smaller, about 8%, but it also lasted uh, 2 months later. So people not only became like specific, like disbelieving of their specific conspiracy, they also became less conspiratorial in general, which is striking and I think very promising, right? It suggests that the models can be very persuasive, which now other work has shown in other domains. And this raises one obvious question. What just happened? Why is this so effective? And why haven't we been able to do this with human beings as the persuaders? And so we looked at this. We said, well, like, is it the fact that people are there's something about AI that they find more credible or trustworthy or unbiased? Maybe if you had a human being deliver the same words to the same people, you wouldn't get this effect. It's about source credibility rather than the information. Um, and of course, this wouldn't be feasible for any human off the street to do because you'd have to know an obscene amount about everything. Like language models are actually, this is a tangent, but I think a point that is important to make, and I'd be curious here to hear what others think. Like, uh, they're a form of collective intelligence. They're trained on all of human knowledge, and in many ways, humanity's intellectual superpower is not like our individual cognition and intellect. Although of course that is remarkable too. But what is more remarkable, right, is like what we know as a group. We have like lots of like specialized instances of knowledge, but even two scientists in the same field rely on one another and have these like complementary and non-overlapping forms of knowledge and expertise, which makes me think that when people talk about like benchmarking language models against human intelligence, uh, we should be benchmarking against collective intelligence rather than individual intelligence. And I think there are some efforts to do this already, right? Like humanity's last exam. But in general, I would imagine a move towards that would be a fairer comparison than like, is this AI trained on all of human knowledge smarter than you specifically? Or is it smarter than everyone at once? Anyway, okay. So did it matter that it was a human? This is 500 people from Lucid. Uh, and our idea here was just to trick people into thinking that we're talking to a human being, and specifically a human expert who knew a lot about the conspiracy, and that gave us cover to like explain why this thing that they were talking to knew so much. And so we varied whether we told participants they were talking to an AI or an expert, and we also varied whether the like affordances of the interaction paradigm and the AI's language made it seem human. So whether it like took a long time and broke its responses into chunks and used language that a human would use, like kind of allowed it to pass the Turing test. And the There are other papers, I think from, I want to say Francisco Salvi, but that might be wrong. Where it's like show that now like GPT-4 could pass the Turing test at a higher rate than human beings can. So I think there's reason to think that we succeeded here. Um, okay, so what did we find? So we replicated the belief change effect, and this was for both conspiracies and like all sorts of epistemically unwarranted beliefs, like whether you believe in ghosts or astrology and things like that. We replicated the effect for the regular old AI neutral within the paradigm, and is about a 12-point change. And we found that it basically didn't matter what we told people and how the model behaved. Uh, in all cases, you got roughly the same update size. So this suggests that it's not so much about the fact that people thought they were talking to an AI, the machine heuristic, but rather the information that the model was delivering. Uh, Relatedly, right, like um, we could also ask like, well, like, is this kind of a time-limited, time-bounded phenomenon? People are already starting to associate different models with political positions. And if knowledge is indeed distributed, that might be a real problem. Uh, Democrats don't like Grok. Republicans think Gemini or ChatGPT might be woke, these kinds of things. And so we randomized how the model was described to participants before the conversation. And in one condition, we said, well, it was trained on materials from a wide range of sources, and its responses are unbiased. Uh, we also had a Democratic model that was trained on CNN transcripts, the New York Times articles, and a Republican model that was trained on Fox News and Breitbart and speeches by Republican politicians. Note that this was not actually true. This is just how we describe the model. So we didn't fine tune to like make it biased. And what you see is um, you replicate the effect once again. So like this is we have three conditions. The neutral one where we don't tell people we they're talking to a neutral bot and you get this update. Yellow is pre-conversation and purple is post. So you see within subjects a decrease. And then an ideologically consistent condition where Republicans are talking to Republican bot and Democrats are talking to Democrat bot, and an inconsistent condition where that's the opposite. And so in the consistent condition, you get the same effect. Interestingly, it's not larger. And in the inconsistent condition, you get the same effect, which is to say that it's not smaller. So again, this is more evidence that it's not so much about the source assessment, but rather like what the model is actually saying and doing. Okay, great. So like, what is the model actually saying and doing? Um, we have different ways of breaking this down, different kind of text analysis protocols. This is just one of them. Uh, but I like this figure because I think it gives you like a very high level sense of what the model is saying and doing. And like effectively what it's doing is using reasons and arguments and evidence. It's providing alternative explanations for the conspiracy. It's using logic and critical thinking. It's providing conflicting evidence, things that directly conflict with what people are saying. And it's also pointing out problems in the person's reasoning. To a lesser extent, it's being nice and it's using Gricean norms. It's saying like, well, here are the things that we agree about before disagreeing. And note too, there's less variance here, so it's always being respectful and understanding. Things it's not doing include like using examples or Socratic questioning, at least not quite prevalently. And it's also not like being psychologically manipulative. It's not trying to appeal to people's morality. It's not targeting their psychology or their motivations and needs. And it's not saying, these things that you're talking about are harmful or bad, and trying to get around logical argumentation. Uh, More formally, we can look at the mechanism, and this is a paper that has been under review, or it's like at Psychological Science, and I have some follow-ups to the working paper. So if you've seen the working paper, this slide won't be new, but I have some new slides to come. So like one possibility that we've looked at extensively already, maybe the AI is perceived as unbiased and objective, and what we did here is like a kind of leave one out or ablation study. So we have a baseline and we're comparing these effects to the baseline. And in the comparison groups, we do one thing differently that knocks out the purported mechanism. So here it's like maybe we tell the participants that the AI is biased and like consistent with those other studies, you don't find anything. Another possibility is that the AI is really nice, and that's like lulling people into a false sense of security. So what if we make it adversarial and make it a debate? Well, that doesn't matter either. You get the same effect. What if it's about information overload and like people are like not reading it, they're just kind of defaulting to a conclusion because they don't care so much. And here we like make the AI's responses considerably shorter. And although interestingly, like just as factual and just as informational. So it's kind of cutting out the fluff, and actually you get a slightly larger effect, although not significantly. What if it's just that like AI is kind of like Cyrano de Bergerac or has a silver tongue, and it's just able to talk really compellingly, and maybe it's not so much about what it's saying, but how it's saying it. And we prompted the AI here. Importantly, we did not tell it to be persuasive. We just told it to be accurate and use factual information, and tell people the truth and kind of give them an informational download, and you get the same effect. So it's not really persuasion; it's more like learning. And relatedly, like what if the mechanism is facts and evidence? So the way to get rid of that is tell the model to be persuasive, like to be Cyrano, but not use facts to do everything else, to use other kinds of strategies. And this is what killed it. I think collectively, right, like this points to facts and evidence and kind of rational Bayesian updating as the prime mechanism. And you can also see this if you like break down these strategies and look at how they predict belief change. So like really like the only thing that falls out of this is facts and evidence. The more facts, the larger the magnitude of the update. Another possibility is that this is about dialogue, the back and forth. All of these things that I've shown you so far are conversations. So we also have a study where in one condition we just show people a fact sheet generated by an AI model in response to their conspiracy theory, versus have them go back and forth in a dialogue. And I'm sorry for the like bluntness of this figure. So this is now like a Bayesian model. So we have the posterior distributions for like the effect sizes. So we are comparing the full dialogue against control, and you get this really big effect about 12 and a half points. And also compare a single message against control, and it's about 10 points, which is not a big difference, is it? And so when you look at this green distribution in the middle, which is the posterior for the difference between full dialogue and single message, it's kind of like right on the border. So there might be a difference. There might be like a 20 to 30% increase in efficacy that you get from dialogue. And this is something that also I'm not going to show today, but that we see in other data and studies too, about a 20 to 30% increase. But you know, it's like for a 12 and a half to 15 point jump, that's actually not huge. So this suggests that the active ingredient, right, is the information. That the dialogue helps, perhaps because it allows you to extract more information, um, or personalize more or something. But really, like the main ingredient, you don't even need a dialogue. You just need a good argument. And so this was interesting to see, and not necessarily what we would have predicted, actually. Um, Relatedly, we can extract all of the kinds of claims of like factual E claims that the model makes under these different conditions, and also look at the number of claims that are occurring in each conversation. And so in the standard prompt, which is like also what we used in the science paper, the model makes about 27 claims per conversation. And the majority of these claims are specific empirical claims. They're things that are easily falsifiable. You can go look up, but it's doing other kinds of informational things too. So sometimes it's like using inference. It's making meta epistemic points about the nature of knowledge. Sometimes it's making like low information claims, so like kind of vague gestural things, like this doesn't make any sense. And then very also doing moral political evaluation. But you can see that the kind of strategies it used were actually fairly consistent across conditions, with the exception of no evidence, which didn't use any specific empirical as intended. And then the full dialogue, we used a more advanced model. We used GPT 5.3, 5.2, I think. So interesting, it made it made a lot more claims, although it didn't produce larger effects. So that's interesting. And the breakdown was slightly different. And then the single message had about half as many claims, but still seemed to work. This suggests to me, right, that like there's probably a few arguments that people remember and that they find compelling. And the models take really a scattershot approach, and like hit the target a few times. So like if you think jet fuel doesn't burn hot enough to melt steel beams, maybe you learn that you're right, but it does burn hot enough to substantially weaken them, to reduce their tensile strength by about 50%, it turns out. And when you have thousands of tons of concrete piled up on reduced tensile steel beams, you get towers collapsing into themselves like a cake. Another thing we found in this paper is that one of the few moderators of this effect, this is in this full dialogue versus single message study, is so-called social embeddedness. So how many of your how many people in your social circle also believe the conspiracy. And it works across the whole spectrum, including for people all the way at 100 out of 100, where they're saying like everyone agrees with me about this. And but the effect is it's like for the full dialogue, it's like 8 points, 9 points, and the single message is not so effective there. But then for people who are kind of like on their own, who think that maybe their friends and family don't agree with them, you get about twice as large an effect. So that's interesting. Another question here is like, what are people actually saying about their conversations? Why did they report being persuaded or not persuaded? And we look at this as well. This is from people's open-ended responses, just like reflection on what they liked and what they found compelling about the conversation. And we did some natural language processing and coded them, and found that most people who were persuaded mentioned facts and logic. That was their primary thing. And similarly, people who uh, didn't find the AI persuasive, their primary thing was that the arguments lacked novelty or depth. So they were saying like the argument just wasn't good enough. It wasn't, but still about 20% were worried about bias, which is notable. And another 17 said it wasn't a trustworthy source of information. So if anything, right, the machine heuristic might be sort of backfiring here. It's not that people are trusting AI; it's that they're distrusting AI. And if they trust AI more, you'll get a larger effect. But information is still kind of potent here. So to answer my question from before, what makes it work? I think it's just the facts and evidence that it provides. And what we see here is like if a human could come up with the same facts and evidence, it would probably work just as well. But of course we can't. Okay, so pause here quickly for any questions that people have because I see actually I've just been talking for a while. So any questions before I keep going? No? Oh, well, thanks. Oh, social embeddedness. Yeah, sure. Let me see if I can remember the exact question. I think it's a 0 to 100 sliding scale. It was basically like how many people in your community or in your it's like maybe friends or family, things like that, uh, share your belief and like how, or you've talked with them about it or something like that. And so the people at 100 out of 100 are have some sort of social pressure to maintain their belief, and some degree of stakes. Um, yeah, yeah. There's more to be said about that. I'm sorry, that wasn't a very good answer. And then so the question of why can people no, I was actually saying that people there's a question that says why can people provide more facts and evidence? I'm actually arguing that they can't. That this is something that human beings are quite bad at least for like most esoteric conspiracies. Right? Like if someone asked you to like debunk um, the moon landing conspiracy, you'd probably be able to come up with some reasonable arguments, but you would not be able to do as good a job as an AI unless you were an expert on it and knew a lot about it. And that's probably even more true for other more obscure conspiracy theories, right? Um, and someone's asking about weaponized AI. Yes, great. That is my next thing. But just to finish up this, we have a website called debunkbot.com where you can go and try this out yourself. And we've had like 100,000 people use it, and we actually replicate the effect really nicely and robustly. So it's debunkbot.com. It's just the top left corner here. I'll just write it in the and we also just introduced, again, I'm not going to talk too much about this, Twitter and or X and Blue Sky, and also Truth Social versions of this that you can tag at debunkbot on a message like at Grok or something, and you'll get a debunking response. And we're using this to run some field studies. So check out the at debunkbot. And age and education, we're not huge moderators. That's a good question. Maybe a slight effect for age. Okay, so someone asked about weaponized AI, and I'm gonna hear. So I have a lot of data on this now because like this is the obvious other side of the double-edged sword. So like we have another study. What if we use this to increase belief in false claims, like conspiracy theories? How resistant would these false claims be to subsequent correction? Are they sticky? And how does the stickiness compare to debunking? And then also, like, assuming that we can do this, uh, how can we prevent it? How can we stop other people from doing it? What sorts of design choices should people who are building AI tools be making to kind of try to advantage truth in the online ecosystem and make things a little more defense dominant. Uh, and so we looked at the question of whether you can have LMs convince people in a few ways. To start, we fine-tuned GPT-4o to get rid of the guardrails that might prevent it from spreading conspiracy theories, and brought in about 1,000 people and randomized to either talk to the debunk bot or what I'm calling the bunk bot, which argues for the participants' conspiracy theory. Importantly, the participants, to preserve randomization, this time talked about a conspiracy they were on the fence about. So something they believed but didn't also totally believe, like about 25 to 75 out of 100 belief. So it's a kind of an equivocal conspiracy, right? Like whereas before I was talking about things that people definitely believed. And it's not just about the belief metric. We asked them to write something that they were not sure about. So the task that they were doing was write a conspiracy that you're on the fence about. So in both cases here, the models were allowed to lie to start. They were allowed to make up evidence to support the conspiracy. And of course, we debrief participants who are in the bunking condition afterward. And the debrief was very intensive, and it included a second conversation with a debunking AI that refuted all the claims made by the bunking. Okay, so the key question here, so we have bunking in red, debunking in blue. Does truth have an advantage? And at least for GPT-4o, when it's jailbroken, the answer is no. You actually get a slightly larger effect for bunking, although it's like statistically indistinguishable. Whoops, sorry, I just kind of had a uh, yeah. Well, anyway, and more happily, the effect went away after debriefing. And actually, after the debriefing, they ended up slightly more skeptical of the conspiracy than they had started out. But it turns out, maybe perhaps due to a surprise, uh, um, it's easy to spread lies with LLMs too. And actually, uh, there's a oh, you know, I'm gonna skip this for the sake of time. Okay, so we also measured other things here. We looked at whether participants rated their AI, the bunking versus debunking, as more unbiased or impartial, and there was no difference between the two models. Uh, However, people thought that the bunking model provided them with more new information, which I'm sure was true because it was making things up. Um, and they also thought that it was nicer and had a more collaborative tone. So they liked it more. And they also thought that it made stronger arguments than the debunking model. Although these effects are about a fifth of a standard deviation. Um, Moreover, talking to both the bunking and the debunking had a spillover effect to trust in AI. So both conversations increased trust in AI in general. And this is especially true after talking to the bunking model, oddly enough. And both conversations had an effect on general conspiratorial worldview or ideation, so not the specific conspiracy that was discussed. So the bunking model made you more likely to believe all kinds of conspiracies, and the debunking made you more likely to disbelieve all kinds of conspiracies. Um, some other ways of breaking down this data, right? There's no difference in the direction of truth-aligned persuasion for the jailbroken model, but we didn't just use the jailbroken model. And I'm going to talk about this in a second. We also, though, extracted every single claim made by both models and we fact-checked them using Perplexity, which we validated against human fact-checkers. And so the y-axis of this plot here in the middle is the veracity score, the average veracity score by each of the models, the distribution of scores. And so the as expected, the debunking model tended to make more true claims than the bunking model, although there was not a huge difference. And remember, we allowed debunking to lie too. We found as well that the proportion of very low veracity claims was about twice as high in the bunking model. So they were making like 10, like just explicit lies per conversation, and debunking was only about half of that. But 10% is still way too high. But again, this is the jailbroken model, and we told it was allowed to lie. We also tested GPT-4o with the regular OpenAI guardrails, and funnily enough, this did not make a huge difference. So it made the debunking less likely to lie, but the bunking was pretty much the same. And actually, you get the same effect for a model with OpenAI's guardrails. So it's just as easy to spread misinformation without jailbreaking the model, at least without jailbreaking 4.0. And finally, importantly, we introduced a third condition where we told the models they were not allowed to lie, that they had to tell the truth. And so the bunking model still had the mission of persuading someone against the conspiracy theory, but here it was not allowed to confabulate or lie or make up new information. And this manipulation totally worked. So as you can see, it was matched on veracity to the debunking model, and both of them told almost no explicit lies. And this intervention, if you want to call it that, actually introduced this very large asymmetry into the effect. So it made it, it didn't change the efficacy of bunking, and it tanked the efficacy of debunking, sorry, and it tanked the efficacy of bunking. So this is, I think, a really promising thing that you can try to do in your own implementations of AI models, or that model providers could try to train in explicitly. And indeed, I think they're already doing this, simply telling the models to tell the truth, and they seem to know how to do that, at least in the case of conspiracy. Um, However, and this is like hot off the survey presses, we then tried this with, and I'm sorry for just not like getting rid of all the drama, and I'm going to walk you through this figure here quickly, because we then tried it with a bunch of different models, and also had people write social media posts. Sorry, I made this just well, anyway. Had people write these social media posts about their conspiracy and indicate whether they were willing to share it. And we also graded the direction of the post in terms of support for the conspiracy. They wrote them pre and like before and after the conversation. And so let's look at the far left graph. I just want you to pay attention to that, because for these new frontier models, there's an advantage to debunk. This is without the truth constraint, so it's just be persuasive. There are no guardrails, and the models are willing to mislead and lie. But now, unlike with GPT-4o, which is perhaps especially sycophantic, you do get this small natural advantage to truth. And GPT-5, because the x-axis here is persuasion in the direction of the prompt, successful persuasion, you can see that for bunking, GPT-5 has a negative effect. And this is because it just didn't do it. It just went off on its own, presumably because of the guardrails that are now fixed. And it said, actually this conspiracy theory is false. So it essentially did debunking. And it had an effective persuasive impact. And same goes for Grok. And you'll note that these effects are a lot bigger. So the models are clearly getting better at persuasion. And they seem to now advantage truth, which is promising. We also notably debriefed the debunking participants in these new studies. And you get this really in addition to the bunking. And you get this kind of fun effect where the debriefing works again, and they end up lower than where they started for bunking in orange. But when you debrief the debunking, which again was allowed to lie, people just stay where they are. So the debriefing doesn't actually work for debunking, but it does for bunking. And I thought that was kind of cool. Okay, what time is it? Okay, 10 minutes. There's so much more. Okay, I'm just gonna jump to the end. There's a bunch of other work on LLM persuasion from other people and from us, including on politics, not just related to conspiracies. We have a Nature paper doing this for political persuasion that I think is really cool, and I encourage you to take a look at this. And whoops, let's see. Okay, I'm gonna skip all the way to the end to leave room for talking. Okay, so. AI seems to be replacing social media as an epistemic intermediary, right? Um, the the world is very complicated. We depend on these intermediaries, as I alluded to at the beginning, to shape our world model, and communication technologies have a really big impact on that. Social media did not do a good job. Uh, Even though in theory it was supposed to be, this democratizing force, it's participatory, it's feedback rich. What ended up happening is the loudest, most morally outraged voices got the most attention. And because you're optimizing for engagement, that had these really gnarly consequences. The reason I'm optimistic about language models is that the way, they're shaped quite differently. They allow for interactive and personalized queries and investigations. They talk to you like an expert does. They can answer your follow-up questions. And they don't just give you kind of these like cues and links to news sources or like they don't tell you what your take should be. They tell you why a phenomenon is or isn't true and supported by evidence, which is a very different sort of dynamic and engagement. And if you're someone who's interested in AI safety and you're like, why do we care what people believe? Because like the AI is going to have these enormous, dramatic consequences for the world. I think I want to like kind of give you a reason to care a little bit. So I want to say that uh, even if we solve alignment, um, you still have to implement that solution. So the one of the inventors of the mRNA vaccine, Drew Weissman, who's at the University of Pennsylvania, has shifted a lot of his attention and money to vaccine misinformation and mRNA related technology misinformation because he realized that you can kind of solve the problem and still not have an impact on the world in the way that you intended because people just are suspicious and don't buy it. So like we need to deal with epistemics for cooperation, for collective action. We need to do it because a shared factual basis, a shared reality is important for governance and regulating power. And we need it because the leaders that we elect are the ones who make the decisions about what to do with the new technologies that we invent. And if we're electing nonsensible leaders because of degraded information environments, that is really going to become a problem. I think, as I've shown, there's a real benefit here to capture. We've extended this work. I didn't have time for it to climate skepticism and HPV vaccine hesitancy and deep canvassing on prejudice. And we've also moved from a pure dialogic interaction to a kind of what I'm calling like an interview and intervene stage where first you talk to someone for like 5-10 minutes and like really get a deep sense of their perspective using an AI interviewer agent, and then use test time compute like the deep research functionality from different model providers to come up with the best sources that are really tailored to the person. However, I think, and this seems to actually work even better than the stuff I've shown so far, but I think there's really like a big problem too, which is uptake. Um, we have this great tool. It seems to work. You can change people's minds with AI. I think if everyone used AI to check themselves and fact check and get information and learn, it would solve a lot of the information environment degradation that we have. Um, but of course, people are not going to do that. If you think you're right, you're not going to fact check yourself. This is like if you know about community notes or Birdwatch, as it used to be called on Twitter, uh, which are those fact checks. The way that actually functions is it harnesses partisanship. So like Republicans fact check Democratic claims, and Democrats fact check Republican claims, and the ones that are correct fact checks get upvoted, and that's what surfaces. Um, in other words, like people are not going to use tools like debug bot on their own. And so the bottlenecks that we're facing are actually like not in the capability. They're in the people trusting LLMs to be useful enough for like an everyday driver on controversial political topics. And then self-initiating, so like actually using it. And the truth is, like, I don't really think that people are ever going to do that. It's just human nature. And you might get it if you give it time. If people come to realize, well, this model is right about everything else, so I might as well ask it like whether immigrants are like negatively impacting the economy or not. But that's like the kind of thing that takes like 10 years to percolate. So I think what we need to do in the meantime is build tools that are going to do it for people in a frictionless way, and it doesn't require them to hit a button and fact check themselves. And rather, it's kind of just working in the background as like an independent tool, like a social overlay, something that like is like explicitly unbiased that helps them think more clearly. And I have some ideas for how to do this. But just for the sake of time, I'm going to stop and answer questions for the rest of the time here. And so thank you all so much.
All right, thank you so much, Thomas. Thank you so much for the presentation. Yeah, let's move over to questions. I am just gonna. Do you think you could just unshare your screen for a moment?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, fantastic. So yeah, thank you so much for this sort of rapid fire almost, I would say, just like here is the data type of presentation around that is kind of incredible how in like a little over a year you've been able to accumulate so much data on this
Oh.
on this problem. Okay, I have please everyone like feel free to add your questions in the chat. In the meantime, I have like 2 pages of questions that
Oh,
I would like to sample a little bit from.
okay.
I think one of the things that is really surprising about this is it feels almost intuitive that story seems to be what moves a lot of people's beliefs on certain issues. Like we see how big, social issues become in like, especially Hollywood and things like that. A lot of stories have a great impact on how we think about like historical moments and sort of how we think
Totally.
about like AI, for instance, is heavily inspired, I think, a lot of people's beliefs about it from, movies and things like that where it goes wrong. And so I think it's very interesting how the role that facts are playing there. So I was very surprised by that.
I
And
oh, go ahead.
no,
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 I
no.
think
So
that's really astute. So I think about stories in terms of um, coherence and like complexity versus simplicity. That human beings like have a bias or prefer, I should say, like the like a solution with the lowest complexity that still accounts for the information that they're seeing, like the lowest Kolmogorov complexity, right? Like and uh, stories are really nice for this because like they provide like a high coherence account, and they're memorable for that reason and other sorts of things. So they're like really competitive. Um, and I see what like the model is doing here is actually like not challenging. It's challenging like the explanation, and that can be in the form of a story or not. Um, it's challenging its like sufficiency rather than its coherence. Like it's saying like, well, like there's all of these other facts and pieces of information that like don't match the story. So like, yes, you might like the story because it's coherent and it's low complexity, but actually like it's failing the criterion of like being explanatorily powerful. And so what you could do is like maybe make a tool that does both that and offers a new story that does account for the information. And I think that that would actually like I would predict at least that it would be more effective than what we're finding here. Yeah.
yeah, that's super interesting because I feel like I've had a lot of conversations with people where if you just give them the facts, like for instance, I had a conversation with an anti-vaxxer and just giving her the facts about vaccinations and so forth. Again, not on the level of ChatGPT, obviously, but what really made her change her mind was once you could, well, for my case, talk about her kids and how it affected her kids and other kids. If you don't get a vaccination, you might actually end up hurting some younger kids who can't get vaccinated. And that seemed to move her, like being able to get that common ground or make it something that you feel in some way.
Hmm.
And so I'm curious, like how these discussions with this AI system can actually maybe even change some of those feelings people have around that. And then as a follow-up to that, I'm also curious of like beyond just rating your belief in these different pieces of information, if you've also thought more about like how people are actually acting with this information in the world. Like, okay, maybe they learn that vaccinations don't cause autism, but will they still refuse to get a vaccination or
Yes.
vaccinate their
So,
child?
so yes, great points. We are, it has, it has been a fraught process, but there's like, there was a field study planned with a large healthcare and or like pharmacy and or insurance. I'll leave it very vague company where we would like blast out access to a fact check to a like fact delivering bot that we made for people who are vaccine hesitant or like candidates for the flu shot or COVID shot. And the idea was to send it out to millions of people and actually look at behavior. And they were underwent leadership changes right as we were about to do it. And so this was in the last flu season, and it got totally scuttled.
Oh,
And so we're now like on this search for other partners. This is with Katie Milkman's group at Penn, and so we have some promising candidates, but no one has like agreed yet. So if anyone out there has like is finds it interesting, but hopefully I'll have more data on that soon because I'm also very interested in the behavioral question. The the at DebunkBot project, which is on Truth Social, X, Blue Sky, and WhatsApp, uh, will give us a little bit more behavioral data because you can look at like posting behavior and things like that if you think that that counts or not. But I agree, like that's a really important question, and I'm hopeful that others will, like in the field, uh, already have these data and will be like publishing them soon. That would actually be my real bet. Yeah.
amazing. Okay, so just want to say that we are at the 1 hour time now, but I hope that maybe Thomas, you can just stay with us a few more minutes and we
Yeah, of
can
course.
answer some more questions. Okay, that's fantastic. And for anyone who is willing to stay those extra minutes, feel free to put some more questions in the chat and
Yeah,
we'll try
I
to
see
pick
that
them up.
Jess parent
Yeah.
has asked. Yeah, so I think that
Maybe we can
okay.
read
So,
it just up
oh
for
yeah,
anyone.
so like it's like what are future projects and that their group is doing a lot on alternatives perception or being able to recognize that there are alternatives to different topics outside of a binary true false. That's quite cool. So the question is, yeah, oh, projects I was alluding to. So here's one that connects to that is like debate. So rather than like having a human argue with an AI, you have a human watch two AI models very rapidly go through, like basically like extract all of the best points from their training data and like leverage it back and forth in a formal debate. And there's a system overlaid on top of it that like kind of acts as a judge that says like, yes, this is a valid argument, this side wins or this side loses, and can fact check it in real time too. So like each one gets a veracity score as we're doing in these studies. And the idea isn't that the person would watch the debate unfold, because that would be very time consuming and it might be fun, but I don't think most people would do it. The idea instead is that they like at the end get this like overview summary of like here are all the points they covered, here's who won each one, here like and because you're explicitly biasing them, you're not reliant on like an intermediary anymore who like you already trust. You're basically saying, well, here's two people who I know are biased and they're arguing who's like right more often and who's wrong more often. And the idea is kind of like, we're evolved to really pay attention to argument as a way to like vet the truth. And so this might be one way to leverage that. Another thing that I think you could do is like make a kind of Trojan horse as a way to get around the fact that people are not going to fact check themselves. So you could build a tool that has another value proposition, like spam or scam detection, where it's like, well, we're gonna like make sure that you never get scammed by like having a little AI assistant that watches. And like as it's doing that, it's also like telling you if you're like overlooking an important piece of information. You can also come up with, I think, nice like kind of UI related things where like maybe it's just a layer on all the text on your screen that like turns like slightly red if it is skeptical of something that it's reading. And you can like double click and get a nice, so it doesn't have to be this dialogic interaction. I think there's a lot of room for like really creative kind of subtle background things that help us think more effectively and navigate the information environment well.
Awesome, thank you. Um, Oh yeah, I don't think that's a question. Okay, so there's a follow-up question here from Patty Moss. So she says, it's great that you're optimistic about AI's impact on improving the truthfulness of people's beliefs, but that assumes unbiased AI models. What about AI increasingly becoming a tool for governments and autocrats to spread their version of the truth? To give an example, we know that Elon Musk has changed the Grok model's stance on things like climate change and American political parties.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is a concern. One interesting thing is that the like meddling with the model's answers on one topic degrades or reduces their capabilities in lots of other things. Like they're general in this important way. So like that's why like when he like did that, it became Mecha Hitler, right? Like essentially, and they had to roll back a lot of those changes. My collaborator and former mentor Dave Rand has this cool paper with Mohsin Mansa at Oxford, and it's just called "At Grok Is This True?" And what they did was they fact check all of the Grok fact checks to see if it was actually biased, and they found that shockingly it did like a good job. It often answered in a way that was aligned with like what an expert would say. And of course, there are these edge cases. And in inspecting some of the actual raw responses, it was sometimes like doing this like subtly biased thing where it would like answer in a way that was true, but like didn't like really like provide like full context. Like it was still like clearly like reasoning. So it's like there's definitely these like subtleties and nuances here. But like all in all, it was not like just out there lying. It was telling the truth, which means that the fact checks it was providing were valuable. And accidentally, Elon Musk has like invented a way to get people who are skeptical of fact checking, to fact check everything. Like these are people who would have like hated fact checking back when it was Twitter, and they're now using Grok. They're actually fact checking, and so I think this is a really nice example of like unintended second and third order consequences of AI being introduced to the information ecosystem. Another example of this, right, is like people are really worried about deepfakes, and also just worried about like bots on the internet of like the fake internet theory and like AI everything and like why even go on social media anymore? Well, great, yeah, you're right. Like let's stop using social media and like actually like engage with information in a different sort of way. And so I think that these like complex system level consequences are just really tricky to model out from first principles, and like it's gonna get who knows what's gonna happen, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's super interesting. I remember I saw a lot of articles. I haven't seen a lot of articles talk positively about Grok and it being accurate, I believe, with a lot of the stuff happening between Israel and Gaza. There's been a lot of articles about it sort of not having the up-to-date information on that and then saying things that were not true, but it's interesting to hear that, like, through a more rigorous sort of survey of it, that it actually tends to be more accurate. Perhaps it fails at more recent
Yeah, I
uh,
think
things.
things that are not in the training data, yeah, right. And that's a trickier, yeah, that's a harder problem to solve because then you're just relying on like the agentic web search capabilities, and like those are actually not that good. I don't think so.
Interesting. Okay, I want to go dig a little bit into. Hopefully, we can take 5 more minutes. We
Okay.
still have a lot of people here, actually.
Oh, thanks for
So
staying with me. Yeah.
yeah. We basically no one has left since the time's up. So it's amazing. People are really into this.
Okay.
So I want to go a little bit into. I mean, you hinted at it multiple times and brought it up here and now. There's sort of two questions that I find very interesting, and they're somewhat overlapping. So you hinted at collective knowledge a few
Mhm.
times, um, and you know. mentioning how these AI systems are kind of making it into social like information ecosystems like Twitter and so forth. But at the same time, we're also seeing when people use tools like ChatGPT that they're using them a lot for information gathering. And so I'm kind of curious, how do you feel about this like information
Mm,
ecosystems that are developing, which are in some sense more isolated? If people start to move away from social media, or social media becomes more of an entertainment type system, and we primarily use ChatGPT as an information ecosystem, clearly social media has led to echo chamber like effects. But is it also good that we start having more isolated information ecosystems at the same time? What do you think about that tension there?
interesting. Yeah. Um,
Just to give some
the
perspective, I think it's very interesting the introduction, like how the introduction of the internet gave sort of credit to almost any type of information, right? All the
right.
information's out on the internet, whereas before you had these organizations that were curating the information, and people were consuming from just a few, fewer sources of data, and then all of a sudden it exploded, right? And
Totally.
now we're sort of going back to this like uh,
Yeah.
single
So
source.
I think that okay. So the philosopher who I already mentioned, Dan Williams, wrote this great piece on public opinion and AI, and for a while, like long before that, actually, he's kind of had this thing about like from communication and media theory about like the Dewey versus Littman debate about like democracy and the role of expertise there. And it's like premised on this really important problem, which is that the world is like for social and political things is just too causally opaque. Like we can't actually get to the bottom of any of it. So we have to rely on intermediaries. And and uh and so that sort of naturally invites technocrats into the conversation. Like you need experts to talk to. You need some sort of vetting system. You need norms. And without those things, there's not like the feedback loops and mechanisms and rewards are kind of just like not in place. You're not burning your hand on the stove. And so I think that actually like if you can get models that act like experts and really like are not sycophantic and answer your questions in a way that an expert would, which we're close to. I totally acknowledge that sycophancy is a problem. I think that it's probably going to be fixed because it's just about it's like the social media problem. It's engagement, right? Like it's like the RLHF and various reward learning makes the models kind of suck ups because people like to use them more. But it feels like hopefully we've learned the lessons of the social media age. Like hopefully we like at least in this one narrow way get like a kind of reset. And I do think that people are worried about sycophancy right now. So I think the models are kind of acting like experts. Yes, they will echo your perspective and agree with you if you push hard enough. And so for the edge cases, like the tail risk people who are like going down these rabbit holes with the models, that seems bad. For most people, I think it's probably okay. I think that like from a policy perspective and like a democratic resilience perspective, one nice thing to do might be to like kind of uh, get some consensus things that like everyone can agree on about like how the model should behave when you're talking to them about really far out things. But the truth is, I don't know. It's going to be different. I agree that like the dynamic change that you just pointed to seems important. I think the counterfactual is social media, and so LMs are better than that at least, but they may have new downsides.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Okay, let's jump back to some questions from people who are. Oh, we had two more people join the conversations. Fantastic. Welcome. Um, okay, so Alec has a question here as well, saying, what do you think about hybrid crowdsourcing AI models like X's community nodes? Would it improve
yeah.
persuasion because people feel like info is coming from the community? And I also just want to highlight there that there's a lot of mixed evidence on the efficacy of community nodes. I know that there are a bunch of papers who claim that community nodes actually do not move people's beliefs substantially on certain issues. So, curious
Mm,
for your take on that, and the comparison with the chatbot models.
yeah. Oh, I would I would be curious to hear your thoughts on the efficacy. My read of the literature, which is admittedly like not maybe not as deep as yours, it did work pretty well. I'm more interested in like how notes works. I guess I just assumed that it did work. Um, but yeah, I'd be curious to hear about this data you mentioned. I think crowdsourcing is great. LLMs are already a form of collective intelligence, like community notes. They are like drawing across what is in the training data, and like for conspiracies, that's good because there's lots of like debunkings. But also for like political knowledge, like they just contain information that like individuals don't have access to. And in terms of persuasive efficacy, I can see how community notes might be more effective because it's like there's buy-in. It's like, well, lots of people who thought about it or looked into it, like upvoted this community node in their internal forum, and now it's getting platformed, and so like that makes it more credible. And so if some kind of hybrid model, that's a really nice idea. Where maybe for like especially common queries, you could have like an LLM surface a bunch of explanations and then have people look into them manually and choose the most accurate one, or the reverse even. You can have not rely on voting. I don't know, but something hybrid might be nice.
Hmm.
That said, another difference between social media, which is distributed, you never encounter the same posters twice, or if you do, it's just like a few big accounts, and LLMs, is that you actually, as the user, can stress test them yourself. Like you can ask them about something that you are very knowledgeable about and see whether it gives a reasonable response, including on a politically controversial topic. And then you can just ask a new instance of that model about something you're less familiar with. So you kind of can actually evaluate it and calibrate if you so choose. And that seems different than community notes and social media too.
Or even ask multiple models, right? There's also some voting in that sense of using multiple
And they're already
independent
using this like
models.
mixture of experts thing. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, super interesting. Okay. I want to just like take one last question and then we'll like let you go. This is just like, in my opinion, too exciting. Uh, okay, so the last one is from Kathy Fang, and she says, "You mentioned at the start of the talk about how things might be different for agents. Could you say a bit more about this?"
Yeah, of course. And I'm sorry, I had to skip over that. I don't think that the UI interface where you type and talk to a chatbot is like the last version of the way that we'll be interacting with AI. And so for coding, for cognitive labor, we're already moving to these like agent frameworks where like yes, you talk to it, but really you're like writing your specification and then it's kind of going off and like returning a work product that it made. And it's not pretending to be like a human with a perspective and these other sorts of things. And it turns out like this is much more useful than just talking to it in a chatbot window. And so I can imagine that like as the model capabilities continue to improve, and as their level of integration into our real life and also technology becomes deeper, and our ability to harness them more comprehensive, uh, it starts becoming like, I'm curious about this thing, go off and look into it, give me a download, connect into my memory. You already know what my priors are. Like you're not like getting a model arguing with you. You're kind of getting some interface that gives you information. And it's not necessarily going to look like text always. We see this with Notebook LM where they can make these really compelling PowerPoint slides and videos and podcasts. And there are other services that are doing this too. And like we know that graphs as visual information are much more persuasive than text, right? And they're clearer too. Like if you show someone a graph, that's better. So I think that like, maybe the agent is like making a graph based on like some report that it's pulling from and like showing you the actual difference or like some kind of diagram that you can interact with. That there are all of these possibilities opening up and I don't think we're quite there yet in terms of capabilities, but I think that is the actual frontier of like the epistemic layer that AI allows for. So that's all I meant by agents. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Thomas, for your talk. This has been I've learned a lot, and I don't know if I would learn more if it was an AI system like giving the talk or not. But yeah, thank you so much for your time. It's been awesome.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Yeah.
Thank you for coming, and thank you to everyone who attended.
Yeah,
Of
thanks to
course,
everyone
thank
for the
you.
questions and the interest. I really please feel free to, send me an email. I'd love to talk more.
Of
Awesome.
course, also
Thank you.
thank you to Vald for hosting.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.